how man has been fascinated with ease of flight of his feathered friend, how he has longed to conquer the skies by developing his own wings. But unfortunately, man best meets his dreams when pressed by the stark realities of necessity. For man to survive the progressive, destructive advances of war, man had to fly, and to fly with the best, the most complete, the most effective, and the safest winged machine he could devise. During the early days of World War II, when he reached for an impregnable bird of defense, American ingenuity produced one of the most effective, the most popular, and the most beloved flying bombers of aviation history, the B-17 Flying Fortress.
Of course, I think the best memory of the 17 was the way I saw it come back with flak. You know, they shoot up the wings, the tails, and the fighters would hit the thing, and you'd see those crews come back, and it brought the crews back. That's the best thing that we could see in a 17, just because it could do that type of thing.
The story of the B-17 begins not in the Second World War, but in the First. In that great and terrible land war, the fledgling airplane was viewed with suspicion and disdain by the military commands of all sides. Since the airplane could fly above and beyond enemy lines, it could, during fair weather, do an excellent job of reconnaissance. This was the historic job of the cavalry, and those commands were less than excited about the new hardware. In the first year of the World War, that was the principal role of the airplane. Airplanes were novel, and those daring young men who flew them were regarded as being special, if not quite military. It was common for pilots of opposing forces to wave at each other should they pass amidst the clouds. It was quickly realized that the intelligence gathered by the airplanes could be used in strategic and tactical planning. Thus, it became important to keep the enemy planes from returning home. For a very short time, pilots began taking pot shots at each other with their pistols, and even throwing bricks at each other. It wasn't long before aircraft were armed with machine guns. Serious warfare then rose above the ground and the sea. The first American officer to come under fire in that war was an aviator, Major William "Billy" Mitchell. Unlike most military leaders of the time, he understood the nature of three-dimensional warfare. He figured that the nation that controlled the air would win any future war. Until 1917, wars were fought on distant seas and remote battlefields. Now it was possible, through technological advancement, to bring the horror of war to the nations themselves. It was the beginning of a strategy of air superiority based on long-range heavy bombers capable of inflicting serious damage to the war-making ability of an enemy. Mitchell was promoted to general and became a post-war celebrity, and used his popular position to promote American air power. Unfortunately, his colorful methods were abrasive to Army and Navy commands who resented the upstart aviators. The airplane had done away with the horse cavalry. The prospect of airplanes being able to drop bombs on enemy troops worried the artillery. The Navy was not at all pleased with the prospect of aircraft taking over their role as protectors of our nation's coasts. It was as a defensive force that Mitchell promoted when his band of ragamuffin aviators sank the captured, unsinkable German battleship Ostfriesland in 1921. The test was sponsored by the Navy to demonstrate the superiority of the battleship in future wars. Although Mitchell's airplane sank the Ostfriesland and other Navy ships, much of the military remained unimpressed. The Air Corps was delegated a minor support role in the military. Yet there were a number of rising officers in the Army Air Corps who understood the potential and future role of the airplane. They and others would keep alive the need for a strong Air Force after Mitchell left the service by means of his celebrated court-martial. An American civilian, William Boeing, felt that other nations were exploiting and developing the airplane more rapidly than the United States, during the time that Mitchell was saying that future wars would be decided by air superiority. Boeing formed a company to build airplanes. Though not related, it was an historic match of foresight and technology. The problem with the visions of General Mitchell and others was that the heavily armed aircraft prophesied did not exist. The airplanes of the time simply could not deliver the destructive punch of a battleship or heavy artillery. Even at its best, the airplane was not as effective a weapon as those already in use. What was needed to keep the United States a first-rate air power was the development of a dreadnought of the sky. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party were making political gains. The number 2 man in the Nazi hierarchy was an aviator and war hero, Hermann Goering. The fragile democracy in Germany, the Weimar Republic, was hit hard by a soaring inflation that left much of the people destitute. The Nazis increasingly came to symbolize the frustration of the Germans. Economic chaos was a red carpet to power, and the Nazis defeated the communists and came to power in 1933. In America, there were rumblings of trouble as desperate people began to cling to any group or force that promised to end the Depression and chaos. President Roosevelt's New Deal extended the role of the national government into the lives of citizens. Controversial and hotly debated, the New Deal seemed to maintain most Americans' faith in their Constitution, and not with the far-left communists or the far-right fascists. It was not a time for Americans to be concerned with the problems of the world. But there was concern in certain parts of the military. The same year that Hitler came to power in Germany, the chief of the Army Air Corps sent a questionnaire to his active duty pilots asking for their comments regarding the development of a new heavy bomber. This was a uniquely American form of reasoning. If the nation went to war, these were the men who would be called to risk their lives. The consensus of American aviators was that the nation needed a multi-engined heavy bomber that could fly long distances and deliver heavy bomb loads from high altitude. It could be said that the original concept of the B-17 came from the men who would eventually fly her. The Boeing company assigned a young engineer named Edward Wells to the 299 project. He would soon lead the effort and become the technical father of the B-17. In the summer of 1935, Boeing rolled out the plane that embodied the high-altitude precision bombing theory. Model 299 was a beautiful aircraft. The XB-15 had yet to fly, and the public was amazed at the size of the new bomber. It looked like it was meant to fly. It looked like it meant business. And 299 performed like a charm. The flying dreadnought had arrived. Seattle Times reporter Dick Williams remarked that it was a flying fortress, considering the 5 gun turrets that defended the craft. At that time, the bomber was designed for long-range coastal defense, another support for the Flying Fortress label. Model 299 set a new speed record on its flight from Seattle to Dayton, Ohio for the Air Corps testing. The Air Corps and Boeing were pleased. While the competitors blushed, 299's crew prepared for the final test. The big plane took off, rose, and stalled, then fell to earth in a fiery crash that claimed the lives of test pilot Leslie Tower and Air Corps Major Ployer Hill. The investigation of the crash revealed the cause not to be with the 299, The pilot, perhaps in his exuberance, neglected to fully pre-check all of the systems before takeoff. A special lock to secure the large elevator-controlled surfaces of the plane when parked had not been released. 299 took off without the pilot being able to control the plane. 299 was not too much an airplane to fly. The 299 was what the Air Corps wanted, and its performance could not be ignored. In January 1937, the General Staff authorized production of 13 Y-1B-17s for service testing. The B-17 was the only bomber in service or on the drawing boards at the time that saw duty in World War II from beginning to end. In April 1937, the German Luftwaffe, supporting the fascist elements in the Spanish Civil War, bombed and obliterated the Basque town of Guernica. It was the first time in history that a city had been destroyed from the air. At the same time that Nazi bombers were practicing future war, the new B-17s were arriving at Langley Field in Virginia. They were assigned to the 2nd Bombardment Group for service testing. Leading that effort was one of America's most experienced bomber pilots, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds. He wanted no mistakes. The future of the heavy bomber program, and perhaps that of the Air Corps, rested with the performance of the new planes and his men. The new Fortresses quickly set coast-to-coast speed records. To demonstrate the ability of the long-range bomber, it was decided to send 6 B-17s to Buenos Aires to extend congratulations to the new Argentine president, Dr. Robert Ortiz. The flight would demand an incredible display of navigation, endurance, and teamwork. The government called it the Goodwill Mission. The mission was nearly flawless, and there was no longer any doubt about the new dreadnought or the ability of its crew to manage it. The military role of the B-17 was defensive, to protect the nation's coasts from enemy attack. That meant locating ships far out at sea and sinking them. Flying to Buenos Aires and back was one thing. Locating a tiny dot in a vast ocean was another. Boeing continued to build B-17s on speculation. The promised production orders never came. Boeing was losing money on the heavy bomber, and the board of directors questioned the wisdom of the program and whether or not the company should ditch the military productions and concentrate on their more profitable commercial aviation aircraft. Only 39 B-17s were ordered for fiscal 1939-1940. That was the year the Nazis brought the world to war with the Blitzkrieg in Poland. General Hap Arnold realized that the Germans put more aircraft in the air during one day of battle than existed in the entire U.S. Air Corps. The world was at war, and America was on the verge of scrapping its heavy bomber program. The government was demanding that Boeing reduce its per-plane cost from the original contract. Boeing was ready to call it quits. Tempers flared in Washington as Boeing and the government refused to budge. The B-17C was the most powerful and fastest bomber yet, with a maximum speed of 300 miles per hour. The improved D model followed, and the Air Corps received 53 Fortresses in 1940. The United States government realized that the best defense against involvement in the war was to support the British. With the introduction of Lend-Lease, the Royal Air Force immediately requested as many of the new B-17s as could be spared. Only months before Pearl Harbor, B-17Cs were fighting in Europe. The British called them Fortress 1. The most advanced bomber in the world was a flop as far as the RAF was concerned. In June 1941, the Army replaced the old Air Corps with a new structure, the Army Air Force. The Air Force was eager to get as many B-17Es as it could and get them into the Pacific to counter the Japanese. 12 of the new B-17Es flew into Pearl Harbor on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Unarmed and out of fuel, the B-17s flew smack into the beginning of World War II for the United States.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The B-17 would never prove itself in the Pacific. The Allied decision of Europe first diverted most B-17s to England, where General Ira Eaker was setting up the 8th Air Force Bomber Command. Strategic decisions were made to keep the U.S. forces together, where they would concentrate on high-altitude daylight bombing, while their British counterparts would pound the Nazis at night. On July 1st, 1942, the first B-17E arrived in England. It was the beginning of an air armada that the world had never seen before and has not known since. Tens of thousands of air crews and support crews had to be trained quickly before the theory of high-altitude precision bombing could be tested. From all over America, young men, mostly in their teens, learned and mastered the skills to fly the heavy bombers. Crews were kept together through training to make them a team. The B-17 and its sister bomber, the B-24, were useless unless the crews knew what to do and how to utilize the bombers to full advantage. The zeal and determination of the young servicemen was more than matched by their civilian counterparts on the home front. The last vestiges of the Great Depression vanished as America resolved to win the second of world wars.
And 1 and 2 and 2 and 1. Oh, shucks, I can't dance.
On August 17, 1942, General Ira Eaker led 8th Air Force Mission Number 1 against railroad yards near Rouen, France. Slowly, the American raids would go deeper and deeper into occupied Europe, then into the German heartland. At first, the German fighter pilots were wary of the giant, heavily armed bombers. But they quickly learned that the B-17 was more vulnerable in head-on attacks and strove to kill the pilots. It wasn't until October 1942 that the Luftwaffe began serious attacks on the formations of B-17s and B-24s. For the young men in the B-17, war meant flak, fighters, guns, bombs, noise, cold, and fear. It was an experience unknown to any soldier or sailor before. The tour of duty for an airman was 25 missions. The odds were against him. But in June 1943, the crew of the Memphis Belle went home, the first crew to achieve their 25 missions. A famous documentary movie was made of their final mission. The B-17 became a hero. She could and would bring America's sons back home. But the B-17 was built for massed self-defending missions at high altitude. It was not possible to provide fighter cover for the missions. And the theories of bomber strategists were put to the test 1 year after the Americans made their first raid into occupied Europe. It was called the Anniversary Raid and would attack deep into Germany. The battle plan called for 2 massive attacks on German aircraft assembly plants at Regensburg and the ball bearing works at Schweinfurt. The double strike plan would disperse enemy fighters and stretch Nazi air defense to the limits. It was a moment that General Mitchell had longed for. 8th Air Force mission number 84 on August 17th, 1943. It was quite possibly the most terrible single air battle of the war. Bad weather delayed the precision timetable. Before it was all over, 60 bombers were shot down or lost. 40 were so heavily damaged that they had to be scrapped. 200 were battle damaged. Over 1,000 American airmen were killed, lost, or wounded. The mission was accomplished, and the Luftwaffe could not stop the attack. But the costs were too high and nearly ended the theory of daylight raids.
Taking it 11. I got him. He's coming around underneath at 10 o'clock. I see him. I got him. Firm left. Get that ball turned on him.
At this time, the flak was heavy. The fighters had disappeared, and the flak became heavier. And I recall looking through my small window about the size of a porthole on a boat, and I could see the flak was bursting all around us. And finally one burst was right in front of the aircraft, which must have tossed us 1,000 feet in the air, and everything turned black inside my turret, which was the smoke coming from the flak burst. And about this time, the pilot decided that it was the end of the day, and he told the crew that this was it, to abandon ship.
The concept of self-defending formations of fortresses and liberators was laid to rest. We had to wait for the introduction of long-range fighters to cover the attacks.
The second mission, I guess, was the worst. We counted the holes in the airplane when we had to land in France. We lost 2 engines. I think we had 365 holes in the airplane. Why no one was killed, I don't know. I was hit. Several others were hit, but no one was killed. It speaks well for an airplane that we flew. We always said the best place to fly in the bomber stream was right before or right after the B-24s, because if there was any fighters in the area, they were going for the 24s and leave the 17s alone.
By late 1944, thousands of new B-17G models and their B-24 counterparts were joined with long-range P-51 Mustang fighters. For a few brief months, the air over Nazi Germany belonged to the Allies, and we gave them hell.
Because we flew in formation tight enough, we had gun support from the other plane. And when the fighters would come in, you don't know whether you hit them or not, and you could see your tracers going off the bellies when they'd turn over. And they'd come in so quickly that they'd startle you in a lot of respect, because you'd be looking in all directions, and then the next thing I was looking in the guy's face one day, and my guns wouldn't traverse enough to get to his position or to take a shot at him. And right there. So, but he immediately fired, and he shot down a couple of planes in front of us, and then bellied over, and they're armor plated on the bellies, and he just tore off downhill.
The B-17 had done its job. Other planes would continue to assert American resolve for freedom, but the role of the Flying Fortress could never be eclipsed. It was a special airplane. Of the 12,000 B-17s built, only a handful remain today, and fewer still are able to fly.
The B-17 was one of the greatest planes ever built, mainly because it brought you home when it had a couple engines shot out, and it was a great flying machine. And the thing that we had the most difficult with when we were there was really flying the long missions. We went deep into Germany at that time, and the flights were almost 10 hours, 10 hour and a half, which was about the range of a 17. And I remember once we went all the way into Czechoslovakia to drop that day, and we came back, and we had part of France won it at that particular time, so we had an alternate base, and we didn't think we'd get back across the channel in the 17 because the gas quite. So we went to look for our alternate airport, and when we got there, there was a zero ceiling on the thing, and so we went down and looked for that thing over and over and over and never could find it. Finally, we ran out of gas, you know, and we had to set that 17 down in the field, and we went right through the fence and the trees and everything, knocked off both engines, and we ended up, we had a tree trunk right to the instrument panel, and all of our guys got and walked away from the crash. And that's quite an experience when you do something like that.
One thing about the B-17, he said that was the commonest home airplane that a man could ever fly. You could get quite a few flak hits and what have you, and it would still bring you home. But you always knew that one burst could bring you down in the right place.
I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart and mind embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
Through the efforts of individuals, communities, and the Air Force, the foresight, technology, and resolve symbolized by the Boeing B-17 is kept alive today. An example is the Air Museum at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Maintained and managed by the 2nd Bomb Wing, the museum tells the story of air power and its role in keeping the free world free.